You know, I thought it would be a lot of fun to finish things up here with you with a discussion on working with some special effects, creating some special effects using CSS. And that's exactly what I want to show you here. And right out of the gate, I want to show you how you can work with RGB color values rather than using named color values or hexadecimal color values, as we've been doing all the way along. We can now specify colors using RGB, which you might be comfortable doing if you use a lot of programs like Photoshop and Illustrator and similar applications. And the other thing that I want to show you as well is how we can adjust the opacity or the transparency of these RGB colors. Let's go and check it out. As you can see here inside my browser, I have some text here which I want to apply some special effects to. So I'll show you how I created that over inside my code. All I did is I threw in a new paragraph, and then just for simplicity's sake, I'm doing everything inline just so we're not monkeying around with extra style sheets and, you know, the cascading effect of CSS and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just working inline here. And here's what I did. I cranked up my font size to 250%. I set a font weight of bold, and I simply aligned the text to the center. Now, much more important is the color that I want to set. Now, of course, what we've seen so far is that I can come in here and I could say color, : space, and then I could do something like, you know, $ FF99CC followed by a semicolon or something like this. This is our hexadecimal color value. Or what I could do is I could come along and say red or orange or blue. We saw that a bunch of times when I was talking about the cascading effect of CSS not too long ago. But rather than using hexadecimal color values or named color values, instead, I want to use RGB. So here's how to do it. I'm going to go RGB, and then in brackets, what I would do is I would specify 3 values. So something like this: number, comma, number, comma, number. That's our syntax. And then after the closing parentheses, I would throw on the semicolon, of course. Okay, so there's our syntax, RGB, and then in brackets, 3 numeric values all separated by commas. So where do we get the numeric values from? Well, we need to know the RGB color values that we want to use. So where do we get those from? Well, check this out. I just so happen to have Photoshop running, and I opened up one of our sample files that we've been working with, cartoon2.jpg. And over inside the toolbox, I went and grabbed my eyedropper tool and I sampled the green that's used in his teeth there or in his eyes. So go ahead and grab that green there if you like. And if you're a Photoshop user, you know that when we sample color, it gets loaded into the foreground color swatch, or we can just hover our mouse over top of the image window anywhere we want. And if we happen to have our info palette handy, and if we happen to have RGB set for the info panel, we can actually read those values right out of the panel. But instead, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to click on my foreground color swatch. That brings up Photoshop's color picker, and there's my RGB color values. 167 for red, 177 for green, and 90 for blue. I could grab the hexadecimal color value, but that's the old way of doing it. So I want to plug in these 3 values, these RGB values. So I'm going to cancel out of this dialog box, flip back over to my code, and I'm going to replace my ends with the actual values that I saw there in Photoshop. So 167 for the first guy, that's red. Next guy is green, 177. And last guy, of course, is blue, and he was 90. Just like that, okay? So there we go. I'm going to save things up. Flip back over to my browser, pay attention to the color that now gets applied to the text there, special effects, bang. There's the green that we saw in Photoshop, the exact same green that we had in Photoshop. It's fantastic. Now, by the way, a quick aside, these color values that we're monkeying around with, and I'm about to show you opacity or transparency as well, these values that we're working with, we can apply to text, as I'm doing here, but we can also apply them to any other color-related values that we could use. For example, the background color of a div, the background color of my page, borders, anything like that. Anything that makes use of color in CSS, I can set the color using RGB values. And also using transparency. Let's see how to pull that off. I'm going to flip back over to my code here, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to specify a 4th value. So it's going to be RGB, And then after the B, I'm going to throw on A for alpha, okay, or transparency. So the first value is red, then green, then blue, and then I'm going to throw on a fourth value for the transparency setting, okay? Now, 0 is 100% transparent, 1 is 100% opaque, or the default, and then what I could do is I could specify, imagine like a percentage. I could go 0.5, and that's going to give me 50% transparency on this greenish color that I sampled out of Photoshop. So here's what I've done. I added on the A for alpha, and then I've thrown on 0.5 on the end there inside the brackets. I'm going to save up my work, head back to the browser and refresh, and now I have 50% of that color. Or I could come back here and I could say, all right, I want 25% of that color by going 0.25. Save, refresh, and now it's getting really hard to see on screen there. It is there. I can just barely see it. Or I could go the other way. I could say, give me 75% of this color. Save and refresh. There we are. Okay? Lots and lots of fun with that one. So as always, I definitely encourage you to experiment and play around with your RGB values, also setting the alpha for your RGB colors as well. And if you're a little bit nervous about browser support, by the way, Internet Explorer doesn't support this at all. So you might want to be careful here. Sometimes what I'll see people do is they'll specify 2 color values. They'll do something like this. One with the transparency, and then one without the transparency. So something like this. Give me a second. I'm going to break this onto a second line so you can see what I'm doing. RGB, and then they get rid of the alpha. Okay, so in other words, the transparency is not going to render inside a browser that doesn't support the transparency. So in other words, we have 2 color settings here. If the browser supports it, it'll display the transparency. If it doesn't support it, then it falls back to this declaration.